Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the new album from Jaden Smith, The Sunset Tapes, A Cool Tape Story. This is the follow-up to Jaden's debut album, Sire, that dropped last year, a project that I didn't get a chance to review on the channel because I just really didn't have time to get around to it. I did have an interest in checking it out though, and I did eventually get around to hearing it in 2018. I didn't really care all too much for the project, but I felt that there was a good amount of potential that was showcased on that album. Even if it's not an album I really enjoyed through and through, I felt like Jaden had the potential to make a good album or even a great album in the future if he maybe fixed some of the problems I had with that project going forward. So of course I was still interested to see what Jaden was going to be doing in the future after that album. He dropped an EP earlier this year that contained some alternate versions of some of the tracks on Sire in this more alternative R&B type sound. I didn't really care for it all too much. I did review it in one of my catch-up reviews if you're curious on checking that out, but it didn't really do all too much for me, and as a result I didn't care for it all too much. But it was just kind of this side EP. It was just alternate versions to already existing tracks. I was still interested to see what Jaden was going to do on a new full-length project, really, when it came to putting out brand new material. So this is what we get here on this new album of his. And overall, I think I like this album less than Sire overall. I wouldn't say it's like a substantial drop in quality or anything quite like that, but it's definitely a less interesting project than Sire was. I just feel that overall, a lot of the things that made Jaden a bit interesting on Sire are kind of gone from this new project here. And like I said, I wasn't a big fan of Sire. I didn't really care for the album overall, but I felt like there was potential in there. But here on this new project, it doesn't really have anything that interests me at all. It's just kind of a boring listen from start to finish. One thing I will say, at least when it comes to things that are better on this thing, I will say that I'm happy that this album is a lot shorter and a lot more to the point in some regards than Sire was. I still feel like this album feels a bit drawn out due to the actual music not being super interesting on it, but in terms of the actual runtime, this thing is a lot shorter than Sire was, and I think that works to its advantage. Also, I do feel like Jaden's rapping on this thing is still decent overall. I didn't feel like he was necessarily a great rapper on Sire, but I thought he was fine enough, and when he got times to rap on that thing, he was able to flow pretty nicely. He sounded alright. Lyrics weren't always the best, and that's the same here on this project, but the actual rapping itself is okay for the most part. However, that's really where a lot of my praise for this thing ends, as much of the rest of what goes on here on this album just did not do much for me at all. Some of the tracks on this thing go for that more moody, alternative R&B type sound that Jaden was dipping into on that EP he dropped earlier this year that, like I said, I didn't really care for all too much. I really don't care for it all too much here either. There are some tracks on this thing, especially in that style, that just feel really drawn out and uninteresting. Particularly tracks like Play This on a Mountain at Sunset, which starts out alright, I guess, but just kind of descends into nothing really about halfway through, and it just becomes a very tedious listen. The same thing can be said for the track Distant. There's just a good few moments on this thing that just feel really drawn out and uninteresting. And like I said before, I was happy that this album is, shorter than Sire, a bit more to the point in that regard. But with tracks like some of these, it just makes listening to this thing feel much longer than it actually is. There's also several moments on this project where Jaden, I think, wears his influences a bit too blatantly on his sleeve, I guess you could say. Like, on Sire, it was pretty easy to pick out his influences, artists like Brockhampton, Kanye West, Kid Cudi, for example. But on this thing, not only does he still showcase those influences, but he also, at times, feels like he's taking the sounds of other artists and just kind of doing them himself. Particularly on the track Plastic, which sounds a lot like a Travis Scott song, from Jaden's delivery on this track to the auto-tune. Just the overall feel of the track feels very Travis Scott in nature. I do feel like, just taken on its own, it might be one of the stronger and more interesting cuts on this album, but the fact that it feels very reminiscent of another artist's sound makes it a bit less interesting, I guess, as a result. Then there's the tracks Better Things and Yeah Yeah that come back to back. which reminded me a bit of Drake in some regards, especially on Better Things, where Jaden's flow and just overall the way he's just, uh, going about saying these lyrics, it just sounds very Drake, like he's imitating Drake's style of rapping and saying things, and it's just really distracting when I'm listening to the track, because it feels like I've stepped out of this project into like a Drake sound like project pretty much. It's really odd, and it doesn't really make the project more interesting. It just makes it seem like Jaden is pulling together a bunch of different sounds from different artists, but not really incorporating them nicely into his own sound as much as he is just kind of taking their sound and just doing it himself. The production across this project isn't necessarily bad or anything, but it's just kind of underwhelming coming off of Sire, where I felt like the production was easily the strongest point of that project. It was, for the most part, pretty interesting on that album, and it at least had me confident that going forward, Jaden was going to have a good selection of beats on his project, if that was what he picked out for his first album. But here on this thing, the beats, they work fine with what he's going for, I guess. None of them sound very out of place or anything quite like that. None of them, I would say, are badly constructed either. They're just not super interesting, and they just kind of, lots of times with the rest of the music not being super interesting, they just kind of blur together and become this kind of uninteresting mass of music that just kind of, it goes in one ear out the other as I'm listening. So the production on this thing was just kind of meh, in my opinion. It wasn't great, wasn't necessarily bad either. It was just very okay at the end of the day, which, maybe in some regards wouldn't be that bad of a thing, but coming off Sire, which had a lot better production, it's a bit of a disappointment. So overall, this album is just pretty uninteresting to me, and it just feels so much less impactful and important compared to Sire, which, like I said, I didn't care for that album all too much, but at least it got me interested in seeing where Jaden was going to go with the rest of his music. But this project here, had this been the debut album instead, I don't think it would have done that for me necessarily, just because there's so little on this thing that stands out to me in any really way, shape, or form. It's just really uninteresting project. I know I've said that a lot in this review already, and I'm running out of voice to say it, so I'm just gonna, get to the point here. I'd only recommend this album really to the hardcore Jaden Smith fans, though I'm guessing by this point you've already heard it. The only tracks on here that I really cared for to any extent were probably the first two, Soho and A Calabasas Freestyle, which I felt like were probably some of the more tight tracks on here, I guess you could say. I felt like Jaden's rapping and singing and were probably at their best on those two tracks. Not that they're great songs, in my opinion, but they're probably two of the stronger ones. Yeah, so maybe check those two tracks out if you're curious as to hearing what this project has to offer. But if you didn't care for Sire, if you haven't cared for any of Jaden's music prior, I don't think that this album is necessarily going to change your mind or do all that much for you. It's just kind of uninteresting at the end of the day, and I can't really see this album staying in my memory for too much longer, given how forgettable it really is. So yeah, that's just my own thoughts on this project, though. If you happen to disagree, if you happen to love this album or anything quite like that, have a different opinion of any sort, perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your opinion in the comment section down below. I greatly appreciate seeing different opinions down there, so feel free to share your own thoughts down there in the comment section. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, countdown lists, all that good stuff. So if you want to see more of that, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching, and stay golden.